Hi there, I'm Patrick Brannon, Mr. Patrick, from the Highlands Biological Station. Today we're going to be talking about salamanders. So what's a salamander? Well, a lot of people think that they are lizards, but lizards and salamanders are actually two very different animals. A lizard is a reptile. A salamander is an amphibian, like a frog. So, like other reptiles, like snakes and turtles, lizards' bodies are covered with scales. Salamanders have smooth, slimy skin. Lizards have claws. Salamanders do not. But the biggest thing has to do with their reproduction. Reptiles lay leathery shelled eggs, but salamander eggs are like those of a frog. So these are spotted salamander eggs, and you can see that they have no shells, and like frog eggs, they have that clear membrane, kind of jelly-like substance. And those little black things in there are the developing embryos. So frogs and salamanders are amphibians, and they have eggs like this. So how can you tell a girl salamander from a boy salamander? Well, for many species, the male has this raised disc on the underside of its chin. It's called a mental gland, and it's used to attract mates. It gives off pheromone smells. So a salamander's life cycle is very similar to that of a frog, at least for aquatic species. So the adult lays eggs in the pond that are jelly-like. They hatch into these larvae, which are like frog tadpoles, and then eventually they go through metamorphosis and turn into the adult. But what about those that live in the forest? Would they have a swimming tadpole-like larvae? Well, instead, they have what's known as direct development. They still go through metamorphosis, but it takes place inside the egg. So when they hatch, they're these teeny tiny little salamanders. So once again, here are some salamander eggs. You can see the little baby salamanders inside. They're often guarded by the mother under a rock, and then eventually they hatch into the larvae, which are a little different from frog tadpoles, but they're the same idea. Salamander larvae, though, already have their legs, and they have bushy external gills. They have a flat tail and a flat head. The flat tail is so they can swim, and the flat head helps them burrow into the mud. So they're different from frog tadpoles, but they will eventually go through metamorphosis and become the adult. So if you find eggs in a pond and you're wondering if they're spotted salamanders or frogs, if they haven't hatched and they already have their legs, then they're salamander eggs. So in our mountains, we have four main groups of salamanders, four different families. The first family are hellbenders. There's only one species in this group. These are large salamanders that live in very clean, fast-flowing rivers, and they're huge. This one is actual size. Sometimes they can get even bigger. They can get up to 2 feet long. Their color blends in with the river bottom, where they hide under big flat rocks, and they eat lots and lots of crayfish. This is actually a North Carolina state listed protected species, a species of special concern. So if you see one of these, leave it alone. It's not legal to handle them. So that's the first group, hellbenders. The second family of salamanders are newts. A lot of people ask, what's the difference between a newt and a salamander? Well, a newt is just one kind of salamander, just like a toad is a kind of frog. But what makes newts different is that they go through metamorphosis twice. They start off in the pond as a swimming larva, then they transform into this thing. It's called an eft. It's like a teenager, and it's bright red and lives in the forest. Then eventually they'll transform into the adult, but it takes several years. The adult is olive green, it has a flat tail, and it goes back and lives in the pond again. So it goes from pond to land, back to pond. You'll notice it's bright red in color, and you might think, well, that's not good. It's not camouflaged. But it wants to be seen. Newts are poisonous. Most other salamanders are not, but these are, but only if you eat them, not to touch them. And this bright red color is a warning to predators to leave it alone. This, however, is a red salamander. It is not poisonous, so why would it be red? Well, it's what we call a newt mimic. A bird or some other predator would see this and not know the difference. They would think it's a poisonous newt and leave it alone. So that's the second group, newts. Alright, so this is the eastern newt. It's a little beyond the eft stage. Now it's turning into the adult, so it's turning olive green, and eventually will have a flat tail and go back and live in the pond again. You can still see it has bright colors because he has toxic skin, so don't eat these. So let's pretend that you're a bird and you want to eat a salamander. Two of these salamanders are safe to eat, but the third one is the poisonous newt. So which one would you pick? Most of you would probably pick this one. It's not red, so therefore you know it is safe to eat. But if you picked one of these two, you had a 50-50 chance of being poisoned. Remember, the red is a warning color. If you picked this one, you were lucky. You're okay. But if you ate that one, that's the poisonous newt. But most birds would pick the black one because they know it is safe because it isn't red. So that's how this one stays safe. It's a mimic of this one. By being red, birds think it's a newt and leave it alone. The third family of salamanders in our region are mole salamanders. Mole salamanders live underground, like a mole. The most common of these in our area is the spotted salamander. They're basically like big frogs with tails, and they eat lots of insects and worms underground. You don't see these very often. They only come up to the surface in the very early spring to lay their eggs. So this is the spotted salamander. Spotted salamanders are subterranean. They live underground, and then they just emerge in early spring to the surface to go lay eggs in ponds. But otherwise you don't see them very often. More than 50 different species of salamanders live in the southern Appalachian Mountains. Most of them belong to this group, the lungless salamanders. They don't have lungs, they breathe through their skin. Most of them belong to two groups within this family. The woodland salamanders, which his scientific name is Plethodon, and the stream or dusky salamanders, and the scientific name is Desmognathus. The stream salamanders have big back legs and a cheek stripe. The woodland salamanders have legs of equal size and no cheek stripe. So let's take a look at some examples. So here are some of the more common species of salamanders in our region. Around streams, you might find this one called the Ocoee salamander. It's small, and even though it lives around the stream, it doesn't live in the stream. So therefore it has a round tail because it doesn't do much swimming. The Ocoee salamander comes in a variety of colors. It can be like this, or it can be darker, or they can have a pattern. So for that one you can't go by the color. You might also find seal salamanders, which are larger, and they have a flattened tail for swimming. When they're young, they have little orange spots. You might also find the black belly salamander. It's large and has a very flat, short tail and a little row of white dots on its sides. And of course, it has a black belly. On land, you might find this guy. This is the most common terrestrial salamander in our region. It's called the gray-cheeked salamander. We also have southern Appalachian salamanders, which are similar, but they have little white dots. And the southern red-backed salamander, which has this, it's a small salamander with a little tiny red serrated back. Then we have two-line salamanders, which are small and have little black stripes, and they're yellow or orange. You might find red salamanders. There's a similar one called a spring salamander. And then, of course, you might also find newts. This is the F stage. And maybe those spotted salamanders. But there are lots more in the region than just this. So why do we have so many different kinds of salamanders? Well, one reason is because our mountains are very, very old. And salamanders have been here a long time and have developed into new species. In fact, if you go to different mountain ranges, you find different kinds of salamanders. So for example, in our region, we have the gray-cheeked salamander. But if you go farther west, you find a species with red legs. And if you go up into the Smokies, you find one with red cheeks. Another reason we have so many different kinds of salamanders has to do with our climate. Salamanders need cool, wet environments, and the southern Appalachian Mountains are very, very humid and wet. We get lots of rainfall here. And lastly, we have a variety of habitats. We have cool, wet forest and lots of mountain streams, which are ideal habitats for salamanders. So if you go looking for salamanders, remember that salamanders are very small and delicate, very fragile creatures, so you have to handle them carefully. If you don't, you could break their tails off. Salamanders can lose their tails as a defense. If a predator grabs it by its tail, it can break it off and escape. Now it will regrow their tail, but we don't want to hurt the salamander by doing that. The second thing to remember is that many salamanders, especially the ones that live in the woods, have slime. Now all salamanders are kind of slippery and slimy, but the terrestrial species can't just swim away if there's danger. So instead, they give off this gooey glue-like slime that gets all over your hands, and that keeps predators from wanting to eat them. And the last thing is to remember to keep the salamanders wet. If they start to dry out, they can't breathe through their skin. Now let's go see if we can find some. So salamanders are most active at night. If you go out at night with a flashlight in the forest like this, you should see lots of salamanders crawling around in the leaves, looking for bugs to eat or looking for mates, especially after it's rained. But during the daytime, it's hot and dry, so they have to stay wet. They usually hide under rotting logs like this. So let's see what we can find under here. Oh, there's one. Okay, so let's see what we found. So this one's called a gray-cheeked salamander. It's probably the most common terrestrial species of salamander in our forests. And since it's a terrestrial species, it's part of that genus Plethodon. It has back legs and front legs that are roughly the same size. It doesn't have a cheek stripe. And when it's harassed, it exudes that glue-like slime, which I'm trying not to get on my hands right now. But anyway, this is called the gray-cheeked salamander. Okay, now that we're done looking at them, we're going to put them back. Set them down gently, and don't squish the salamander, but be very careful to put the log back so that you don't disturb its habitat. So there are lots of salamanders that live in creeks like this. They come out at night, but they hide under rocks where they're safe from predators, including each other. Many salamanders eat each other. So let's see what we can find under the rock. There we go. All right, so let's take a closer look at this salamander. So this is a juvenile seal salamander. Seal salamanders are aquatic. They have long, narrow, tapered, flattened tails for swimming. When they're an adult, they get to be about the size of my finger. And they're brown with little dark wormy markings. But as a juvenile, they have little orange spots, which you might be able to see a little bit on his back. So when you're looking for salamanders, try not to disturb the habitat. When you lift a rock, always put it back. I'm going to put these salamanders back. I'm just going to dump them next to the rock. But I'm not going to set the rock on them. I don't want to hurt them. But be sure to put the rocks back so that you don't disturb the habitat. Salamanders can be what we call biological indicator species. They're very, very sensitive to environmental change. So if you begin to see differences in the numbers or types of salamanders, that could tell you that something is happening to the environment that needs further investigation. A disappearance of salamanders in the stream could be due to pollution, such as fertilizers or pesticides, or even sedimentation, filling up the creeks and hurting salamanders. So the southern Appalachian Mountains are the salamander capital of the world. In old-growth forests such as this, there can be as many as 1 or 2 salamanders for every square meter of forest, so they're everywhere. The Highlands Biological Station is world-renowned for salamander research. Many classic studies of salamanders have taken place here and in the surrounding mountains. In fact, we've even incorporated it into our logo. So, for more information, please visit the Highlands Biological Station website at highlandsbiological.org, and I'll see you next time.